everyone. I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Man on the Bus. When I was 19, I studied abroad in Peru. It was a different world for me, vibrant, unfamiliar, and often overwhelming. As a white foreigner, I stood out wherever I went. And while some of the attention was harmless, it was often intrusive and sometimes unsettling. I became used to whistles, stares, and catcalls echoing through the dusty streets, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that slow-moving city bus one muggy afternoon. I had only taken that route once or twice before, and even then, never alone. The bus felt aged and rusted, swaying on its frame as it took on passengers at each stop. That day, a man, probably in his 60s, stepped onto the bus, scanning the seats deliberately. When his eyes met mine, I felt something shift. Without hesitation, he sat down right next to me, even though there were other empty spots. He was white too, dressed casually in a baseball cap and t-shirt, and began speaking to me in English, asking if I was American. I nodded, unsure of where the conversation was heading. My instincts were already on edge. He told me he was from Lima and loved learning languages. I nodded again, trying to end the interaction without being rude, but he continued, asking where I was going. I told him the general neighborhood, deliberately leaving out the exact stop. That's when he said something odd. He claimed he could read palms. I responded with a flat "great," hoping it would signal disinterest. Instead, he leaned in closer and told me he didn't do readings for free. He offered a trade, English lessons for palm readings. The whole thing felt like a trap. I politely declined, telling him he was already great at English, but then he reached out, grabbed my wrist, and flipped my hand upward to examine it. I froze. He stared at my palm, then looked at me and said he saw something very interesting, something I really needed to know, but he would only reveal it in exchange for those lessons. He asked for my phone number. I lied and said I didn't have a Peruvian phone yet. He didn't like that answer. Instead, he insisted on giving me his number. He scribbled it on a piece of paper and wrote his name as Colo. That threw me off. In Peru, the term Colo is complex, sometimes derogatory, sometimes reclaimed, but almost never used casually by a white man. I asked him why he used it. He just smirked and told me not to worry about his real name. That's when a deep discomfort settled into my chest. I smiled thinly and folded the paper, pretending to be polite, but he wasn't done. He stared at me with this icy calm and said he didn't believe I'd call him. He claimed it had happened before. A woman from India didn't follow through, and something bad happened to her. The words chilled me. I tried to stay composed, tried to summon some fake cheerfulness, and said I'd definitely call. He narrowed his eyes. "You're not looking at me," he said. And then, without warning, he grabbed my face with one hand, forcing me to look at him. His fingers dug into my jaw, his grip steady and strange. I said again that I'd call, louder this time. He finally let go. My heart was racing. I told him I had to get off at the next stop. He looked around and said we weren't there yet, then casually draped his arm across my legs, physically preventing me from standing up. I panicked silently, watching the city blur by, willing the bus to reach my neighborhood faster. When it finally did, I stood up abruptly. He hesitated but didn't follow. I stepped off the bus without looking back, trembling as I walked down the dusty sidewalk. I threw the piece of paper away at the first trash bin I passed. My legs were shaking. I couldn't believe how close I had come to something I couldn't fully name, but my body knew the danger, even if I didn't have the words for it at the time. I never saw him again. He didn't reach out, and nothing ever came of it. But the memory stayed with me, sitting in my gut like a stone. I often think back and wonder what might have happened if I'd given him my real number, or if I'd missed my stop, or, God forbid, if he'd followed me off the bus. I was just a college student, trying to explore the world, but that afternoon reminded me how quickly curiosity can be mistaken for invitation. how politeness can be twisted into opportunity, and how easily fear can become invisible when no one else speaks your language. For weeks afterward, I rode buses with an aching tension in my shoulders, constantly scanning the faces around me. I started sitting near the driver or standing instead of sitting, ready to jump off if I needed to. The other volunteers I worked with told me I was being paranoid, but I didn't care. Safety is often measured by what doesn't happen, by what we narrowly escape. I didn't tell my host family or the school coordinator. I kept it to myself, worried they'd think I was overreacting. Maybe I was. But even now, years later, I still remember his hand around my wrist, his fingers under my chin, his voice low and threatening in that gentle, casual tone. I don't think he was trying to hurt me that day, but I think he might have, if I hadn't lied, if I hadn't stood firm, if I hadn't gotten off that bus exactly when I did. That story became a quiet part of my past, filed away in the almost drawer, where you keep the stories that don't end in horror but could have. I still remember the way the afternoon light slanted through the dusty bus window, how the street signs blurred into unintelligible shapes, how foreign the city felt in that moment. For all its beauty, Lima had shown me something darker that day, a reminder that danger doesn't always come with flashing lights or clear warnings. Sometimes it comes in the form of a friendly stranger, with a soft smile and a firm grip, speaking your language in a place where no one else can hear. Story 2. Boro. In 2014, I was in a strange but liberating phase of my life. My journey began in Southeast Asia, a place that felt like a dream: warm air, colorful chaos, and the subtle hum of change echoing through everything. I backpacked through Vietnam and wandered across Thailand, until I found something that felt meaningful, an opportunity to volunteer at an ape sanctuary. I had always loved animals, and this chance to work closely with endangered gibbons seemed like the perfect antidote to the career-driven burnout I had left behind. The sanctuary asked for a deposit, which would partially be returned after 3 months of service. I didn't hesitate. It felt like the beginning of something right. The early days were beautiful. The place was full of passionate young volunteers. We worked hard, often in the heat, sweating and smiling, feeding, cleaning and educating tourists about the cruel reality behind animal tourism. Most of the animals had been rescued from horrific conditions, abused, overexploited, or discarded. Many were gibbons that had been used as props for tourists. These were not the happy creatures from Instagram snapshots. These animals had been beaten, their fangs ripped out, and many had endured the trauma of watching their families killed by poachers. We learned that for every one baby gibbon stolen for the tourism trade, around 15 others, usually mothers and fathers, were killed. The babies were ripped from their homes, drugged to stay awake for nighttime photo ops, and forced to interact with drunk tourists. By the time they were too old or aggressive to be useful, they were often killed or abandoned. Our mission was to help the survivors recover, and possibly return them to the wild, but many would never leave. Their damage went deeper than their visible scars. Some gibbons hated blonde women, some hated men, some were quiet, some were loud, some simply refused to look at you. Others latched on like shadows. I had my favorites and they had their quirks, but none of them would ever truly be the same again. One particular gibbon, a female, took an odd interest in me. Every time I passed her cage, she would start pleasuring herself, furiously and unapologetically. Her partner didn't seem to mind or even care. I learned to laugh it off like the others did, part of the weird, wild rhythm of life at the sanctuary. Our days were filled with cutting fruit, mixing cement, being swarmed by mosquitoes, and feeling like we were doing something noble. It was hard labor, but it felt selfless, purposeful. It was in this mix of wonder and fatigue that I was assigned to the quarantine zone. Tourists were never allowed there. The animals in quarantine were those too broken to ever return to the wild. Some were dangerously aggressive. Others were mutilated or terminally ill. They were ghosts of what they had been, living reminders of what cruelty does to the innocent. Nenny was the first I met. She was unpredictable, self-harming and volatile. If you didn't feed her first, she'd throw herself on the floor, scream and bite her own arm. She terrified me at first. She would wait for your back to turn, then scream and slam herself against the bars. Then there was Fanta, who moved like a shadow. He was blind, both eyes pale and foggy. His fur had fallen off in patches. His breathing was loud and ragged, and he moved slowly, carefully, like each step required permission. Feeding him involved shaking his basket so he could find it. There was Pam, a quiet elderly gibbon missing a foot, a hand, and nearly all her fingers. She was calm, stoic even, and the only one we were allowed to touch. We had to apply cream to her wounds, and she would only tolerate it if we gave her a massage first. I could see the sadness in her eyes. She missed companionship. She missed being groomed. She tolerated us not as caregivers, but as replacements. There was a story that once a volunteer found her water bowl empty, which was strange because with only 2 fingers she couldn't drink quickly. When he turned the container over, a scorpion fell out. Most of the animals in quarantine were unforgettable, each one a living testimony to cruelty. But there was one who would haunt me forever. His name was Boro. Boro was large for a gibbon, muscular and silent, with a stare that could pierce through metal. He still had his fangs, unlike most others. He didn't behave like the rest. When it was feeding time, the others would go wild. Boro remained still, often already chewing something. One day, I noticed black feathers drifting down from his perch. He had caught a bird and was eating it raw. He hated the hose we used to clean cages, not because of the water like the others, but because it represented control. Whenever I passed by with the hose, he would lunge at the bars, trying to grab it from me. He didn't care if he got soaked. He only cared about overpowering me. Every time I entered the quarantine zone, I felt his eyes on me, watching, waiting. Hidden in shadows, he'd lunge at the fence when I got close, his clawed hands reaching through the bars at face level, always just missing. The keepers said they'd never seen anything like it. He didn't act like an animal. He acted like someone with a score to settle. One day, a spider had built a giant web between a tree and the cage next to Boro's. I didn't want to walk through it, so I tried to squeeze around it, closer to his cage than usual. Big mistake. I felt his fingers clamp onto the collar of my shirt. I barely held onto the tree beside me. If I hadn't, he could have pulled me against the cage. As I pulled away, my shirt tore and I fell face first into the web, covered in sticky strands. I took a walk afterward to calm down. When I returned, Boro was sitting in the shadows of his hut, breathing slow and heavy, watching me. That was the last time I saw him alive. A few days later, over lunch, the keepers told us what had happened. That morning, the sanctuary was quiet. Too quiet. Gibbons are usually loud in the morning, their cries echoing across the trees. But that day, there was silence. When the keepers reached the quarantine zone, they found a large red puddle beneath Fanta's cage. What remained of him was scattered, parts in his food basket, on the floor, and lodged in the fencing. Boro's cage was empty. They pieced it together later. His hut, bolted to the rear wall of his enclosure, had rusted. With his strength, he had torn it loose, squeezing through the hole left behind. He likely lured Fanta to the edge by rattling his food basket. The attack was brutal. No other animals were harmed. We were supposed to check the cages for damage weekly using a hook tool to test for rust, but the job was hard, and many volunteers, including me, often neglected it. The one person capable of tracking gibbons, a skilled local climber and alcoholic, had no luck finding Boro. The forest swallowed him whole. Every time I walked near the edge of the sanctuary, I imagined Boro was watching. Some tourists were attacked by a wild gibbon later that week, but nothing conclusive was found. Then one night, I heard something outside my window. A slow, rattling breath. I held my own breath and didn't move. My window had only a mosquito net, no glass. I was certain it was him. He paused, listening, then silence. He was gone. The next morning I gave notice. It wasn't just Boro. Many of the volunteers I had grown close to were leaving, and something in the air had changed. The sanctuary didn't feel safe anymore. I didn't feel safe. I left the money I had deposited without asking for it back, knowing it would go toward better cages or medical care. I never found out if Boro returned, or if he lived out his final days in the forest. Sometimes I think about him still, how his hatred wasn't madness, but a shape carved by trauma. He wasn't evil. He was wild. He was broken. He was surviving the only way he knew how. His story is one I can't forget, not because of fear, but because it reminded me how easily we dismiss pain in animals, how easily we assume their rage is unreasonable. Bora was a mirror for something deeper, something we often ignore. And deep down, I know he didn't want to hurt me. He just didn't trust the hand that once fed him fear. Story 3. The Seven Outside. It happened while I was studying abroad in Milan, a beautiful city full of elegance, energy, and a subtle pulse of tension I didn't always recognize until it was too late. I was 21 at the time, a woman used to traveling alone, navigating the streets and stores of the city with a growing sense of confidence. That evening was like any other. I had decided to pick up groceries at the Pam Supermercato near my apartment. I remember it was quiet inside, cool and fluorescent, the familiar sound of carts rolling over tiled floors. I went about my shopping like usual, walking slowly along the aisles, comparing brands of tuna and making mental notes about prices. At the far end of the aisle, I saw a man glance my way. He did a quick double take and then leaned toward another man beside him. Soon both of them were staring at me openly. I ignored it at first. After all, I was used to it. Traveling as a woman sometimes meant enduring unwelcome looks. It didn't always mean danger. I turned into the next aisle, scanning shelves for tomatoes, but I could feel them again, watching me from the other end. I shifted my posture and pretended to examine the labels behind me so I could glance back without being obvious. That's when I saw 2 more men had joined them. 4 men now, all looking in my direction, whispering and smirking like they shared some unspoken joke. The mood changed. My skin prickled with a cold awareness, a sensation that wasn't fear exactly, but something like a warning. I walked away and gave them a sharp look, a silent sign that I knew what they were doing, and that I didn't appreciate it. They didn't follow. Instead, one by one, they slowly made their way out of the store. I watched them go, trying to reassure myself. Maybe they were just being gross. Maybe that was it. I took a deep breath and made my way to the checkout lane, ready to finish up and head home. That's when the store manager approached me. He looked nervous but polite, asking quietly in accented English if I spoke the language. I nodded, unsure of what he needed. "I want to warn you," he said, hesitating as if even forming the words felt wrong. "There are 7 men outside. They are waiting for you." I froze. He repeated it, softly but firmly, like someone sharing something they wished they didn't know. 7 men. Outside. They are saying things about you. You should not go out. Please wait here. My throat went dry. I tried to ask him what they said, and he only shook his head. "You do not want to know. But they describe you. Yes, it is you. They wait for you." The color drained from my face. I walked to the front of the store and looked through the large glass doors. Across the street they stood in a loose, spread out line. 7 men. Pacing. Watching. Waiting. It was like being trapped in a waking dream. My heart began to pound in my chest, not from panic, but from the slow realization that I was being hunted, or at the very least, cornered. I reached for my phone and began scrolling through my contacts, trying to think of someone I could call, someone nearby. My mind was foggy with fear. Every name I passed felt too far, too slow. I couldn't move my feet. That's when the manager came back. "I called some police," he said gently. "They are coming now. Please stay here." I nodded, clutching my phone like a lifeline, not knowing what else to do. A few minutes later, I saw the officers arrive, walking calmly toward the group, and just like that, every one of the men scattered. Like cockroaches in sudden light, they ran. No fight, no resistance, just retreat. It was over as quickly as it had begun, but the unease lingered. The store manager turned to me and offered a small, sad smile. "You are lucky," he said. "Be careful always." I thanked him, my voice catching slightly, the weight of gratitude heavier than words. I didn't ask for his name. I never saw him again, but in that moment he may have saved me from something unimaginable. I often wonder what would have happened if he hadn't noticed, if he hadn't warned me. Would I have stepped out those doors into a nightmare? 7 men. That's not a coincidence. That's not harmless. That's not curiosity. That's a plan. They had waited. They had talked. They had shared something I was never meant to hear. But somehow, the universe let me listen anyway. In the days that followed, I walked a little faster and kept my head on a swivel. The sunlight in Milan felt dimmer. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even when no one was around. The incident changed how I moved through the world. It didn't make me paranoid. It made me cautious, alert. I lived to the subtle signs I used to ignore. People often think danger announces itself with shouting or running, but sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it stands across the street and waits. And sometimes it's the kindness of a stranger that draws the line between safety and suffering. That store, that day, was a thin veil separating the world I knew from a world I never want to see. Looking back, I don't replay the fear. I replay the decision. The moment the manager chose to speak, to intervene, to treat my safety as something worth protecting. He didn't owe me that, but he gave it freely. And because of him, I'm here to remember. The truth is, when you're a woman moving through the world, you learn to read the atmosphere like a barometer. You sense the pressure drop. You feel the tension even before it forms. That night in Milan taught me to trust those instincts. It taught me that sometimes the people watching you are not just curious. Sometimes they are preparing. It was a close call. A too close call. I never told my family. I didn't want them to worry, but I've never forgotten it. And I've never taken safety for granted again. It's not just about being aware. It's about recognizing the moment when you're no longer just being watched, but being targeted. The difference can be the seconds between crossing a threshold or stepping into a trap. I was fortunate. That night ended with a warning, not a headline. But that doesn't make it any less real. That doesn't make the danger any less chilling. 7 men, 7 shadows. All it took was one voice to pull me back into the light. Story 4. The tram ride. At 22 years old, I was living and working in Prague, a city whose charm wrapped around me like ivy, at once beautiful, old, and quietly mysterious. I had been there for nearly a year, teaching 3rd grade at bilingual school during the day and working night shifts as a doorman for a tourist-heavy bar near the center of the city. My life was strange and full, a blur of Czech language, late nights, and the rhythmic clatter of the tram that carried me home from the heart of the city to a district called JCP, where my small apartment waited like a quiet sanctuary. On weekends, I'd usually finish work between 3 and 4 in the morning. The city at that hour was a different world, haunted by the echo of footsteps, populated by drunk laughter and flickering streetlights. I had developed habits to protect my space. One of them was wearing headphones even when my phone was dead. They weren't for music. They were a shield, a way to remain invisible. That night I was standing at the back of the tram. It was mostly empty, save for the occasional staggering local or the inevitable group of tourists fresh from Prague's chaotic nightlife. A group of 7 men boarded loudly. Their energy entered the space before they did, aggressive, rowdy, and unmistakably drunk. I pegged them instantly as British, probably in the city for a stag party. Their voices were loud and slurred, ricocheting through the silent carriage. I tried to shrink into my coat, eyes glued to my Kindle, pretending not to hear them. It didn't work. One of them shouted, "Eidspletiv," the Harry Potter-looking girl, a sentence that made the blood in my veins run cold. Another replied, "Like she'd let you, mate." The first one laughed, like I'd give her a choice. There was more laughter, more clapping, more fists pounding into palms like drums of threat. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just sat there, silently willing the tram to move faster. One of them asked loudly, "How can you even tell that's a girl?" And another answered, "Only one way to find out, isn't there?" Followed by laughter that felt like knives. I kept my face glued to my screen, trying to pretend I didn't understand them, but I understood everything. My heart was racing, but my face remained still. My stop was only 2 away. I told myself to stay calm. Get off at your stop. Don't run. Don't panic. Don't show fear. I waited. My body tensed as we neared the station. I prayed they would stay on the tram, that maybe their route was different. But when I stepped off, so did they. All 7. I didn't look back, but I could feel them behind me, like a storm that hadn't broken yet. The air was thick with their laughter. I turned up the block and started walking faster, heart hammering in my chest. I crossed the street in a strange zigzag pattern, something I had done before to check if someone was following me. They followed every movement. My pace quickened. So did theirs. The laughter was louder now, closer. Still, I refused to look back. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I could feel them gaining. Each step echoed louder than the last. I turned the final block toward my apartment and then ran. Full sprint. My keys were already in my hand, arranged between my knuckles just in case. I hit the main door of my building, slammed it shut behind me, and threw the deadbolt. Even though it didn't have a handle on the outside, I still didn't trust it. My breath came in gasps. I backed into my room, the one that faced the street, and sank to the floor. Outside, through the open window, I heard them. "Where'd that expletive go?" one of them said, followed by laughter and the sound of pacing footsteps. I stayed on the floor, shaking, my body vibrating with adrenaline and fear. I stayed there long after the voices faded. I didn't move until I was sure they were gone. Even then, I only crept to the window and closed it. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about the sounds, their voices, the threat hidden beneath their laughter. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't harmless. It was a game to them. A hunt. I kept asking myself what would have happened if I had fumbled my key, if the door hadn't locked, if I had looked back and stumbled. There are 1,000 ways that night could have ended differently, and I live with that knowledge. In the days that followed, I moved differently. I memorized tram schedules to avoid waiting outside alone. I carried pepper spray in my jacket pocket and walked with my keys ready. I stopped wearing headphones altogether. Every echo of footsteps made me look over my shoulder. I never saw them again, but their laughter haunted me, a cruel reminder of how thin the line is between ordinary and dangerous. People like to imagine danger as something obvious, muggers in alleys or shadows in the dark, but more often, it wears the face of a tourist, a joke, a group of friends on holiday, smiling and laughing, right up until the moment they decide you're a target. What disturbed me most was not just their words, but the casual way they said them, as if violating someone wasn't a crime, but a punchline, as if I wasn't a person, just something to be devoured. That night, I learned what it feels like to be prey. It's not like the movies. There's no music, no dramatic escape scene. There's just the slow, suffocating realization that no one is going to help you, that you're alone. And if you survive, it's because you outran them, or outsmarted them, or were lucky enough to have a lock that held. I never reported the incident. What would I say? That I was followed. That they said things. I knew what the response would be. No crime, no evidence. Just fear. Just another story dismissed. So I kept it to myself. But it changed me. I became sharper, more aware, less trusting, and more determined never to let someone take away my sense of safety again. In a strange way, I reclaimed power through that awareness, because while they laughed and plotted, I stayed calm, stayed fast and got away. That might not sound like much, but in a world that often doesn't listen until it's too late, surviving is sometimes the only voice you have. To this day, I still think about them, not with fear but with fury, because they don't remember me, but I remember everything. I remember the cold look in their eyes, the sound of their steps, the words they said like they meant nothing. And I remember how close I came to becoming another story whispered in a headline. I walked home that night and locked my door. But so many don't. So many never get the chance. And that's why I tell this story, not for sympathy, but for survival. Because someone, somewhere, needs to know that trusting your instincts isn't weakness. It's wisdom. It's armor. And sometimes it's the only thing standing between you and the people who think they can take whatever they want. Story 5. The Helicopter Pilot. When I was 12, I took my first solo flight. It wasn't unusual in my family. I'd been flying back and forth between my mom and dad since I was 8, always as an unaccompanied minor. Up until then, I had been paired with a flight attendant, escorted through terminals like precious cargo. But at 12, I was deemed old enough to navigate a layover on my own. And at the time, I welcomed the independence. Airports had always seemed like exciting, glowing limbus to me, transient spaces full of promise and movement. That day, I had a few hours to wait between flights. I sat quietly at my gate, my backpack tucked at my feet, reading a book. The terminal was half empty, filled with the low buzz of conversations, the occasional page from the intercom, and the distant clatter of rolling suitcases. That's when a man approached me. He was tall, wearing a flight-style jumpsuit with patches and zippers, the kind you'd imagine on a helicopter pilot. He looked official, relaxed but confident, and I didn't question his presence. He smiled and asked if I was waiting for a flight. I nodded and told him I had a layover before heading to visit my mom. He said he was a helicopter pilot. Between flights, just killing time before he had to head back out. I had been raised to trust people in uniforms. I had been taught that they were safe. This man wore authority like a second skin, and I didn't feel afraid. Not yet. He sat down beside me and chatted casually, asking about my school, where I was flying to, what books I liked. His questions weren't overly personal, but something about the way he looked at me felt like he was trying to memorize me, like I was a riddle he wanted to solve. After a few minutes, he said, "You want to grab a donut or something? I know a place down the hall." I hesitated. I wasn't hungry, but he smiled and said it'd be his treat. "I've got time to spare," he added. "Don't worry, I'll make sure you're back before your flight." For a split second, I almost went with him. I stood up halfway, even took a step forward before something in my body screamed no. I stopped cold, my skin prickling. Something didn't feel right. My instincts, those invisible sensors we're all born with, suddenly flooded my chest. I turned and said, "Actually, I should stay here. My flight's soon." His smile faded for a moment, but he kept it casual. "Are you sure? It's just a quick snack." I shook my head and sat back down, forcing a polite but firm expression. He looked disappointed, like a child denied a toy, but then nodded and said maybe another time. Then he pointed out the window toward the parking lot. "That truck out there," he said. "That's mine. If you ever want a tour of a real chopper, I could show you sometime." His voice was light, but my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I didn't respond. He gave a small wave and walked off, disappearing into the crowd like smoke. I sat frozen for a long time after he left, staring at the space he'd occupied, trying to understand what had just happened. My mind looped over the details: his uniform, his smile, the casual way he offered candy wrapped in conversation. I realized he hadn't shown a badge. He hadn't had luggage. He wasn't wearing a name tag. He hadn't mentioned his airline. And he had zero reason to talk to a child traveling alone. That moment became one of those early, chilling lessons in danger. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers, that smiles, that pretends to be helpful. I never reported the man. I didn't know how to explain it. Nothing had happened, and yet everything almost had. In the years since, I've often thought back to that afternoon. I think about how many children are taught to be polite, to trust authority, to comply with adults, even when something feels wrong. I think about how close I came to walking out those doors. I don't know if he intended to hurt me. Maybe he just wanted company. But I know this: predators don't always wear masks. Sometimes they wear smiles and offer donuts. They speak softly. They act friendly. They count on you doubting yourself. That day I learned to listen to the voice that doesn't always have words, but always has truth. That voice saved me. It took a long time for me to stop feeling ashamed about almost going. For a while, I blamed myself. How could I have even considered it? But the truth is, danger doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like kindness. It feels like flattery. It sounds like someone doing you a favor. That's what makes it so hard to identify. And that's what makes it so important to tell stories like this. Stories that didn't end badly, but easily could have. Because for every survivor who trusted their instincts in time, there are others who never got the chance to turn back. After that trip, I became different. Not bitter, not afraid, just more aware. I noticed the way adults sometimes lingered too long in conversations with kids. I noticed how charm could be weaponized. I paid attention to the way someone's eyes scanned a room, not looking for exits, but for opportunities. I learned to recognize those quiet, calculating glances, and I carried that knowledge with me into adulthood. Some call it paranoia. I call it preparedness, because no one ever expects their story to become a warning until it's. Sometimes I wonder who he was. Was he really a pilot? Did he work at the airport? Or was the uniform just a costume? A carefully chosen disguise designed to disarm? I'll never know. And maybe that's what haunts me most. The not knowing. The fact that he could have been anyone. That he might have tried the same thing with another girl the next day. Or the next week. And maybe she didn't get that rush of instinct. Maybe she said yes. That possibility sits heavy on my chest when I think about it. It reminds me why I never downplay these kinds of moments. Why I always tell people, even if it feels like an overreaction, it's better to be safe. I don't go through airports the same way anymore. I watch people. I notice the ones who linger near the gates without boarding passes, who sit beside children without a clear reason. I sometimes feel like a detective in passing, scanning for danger dressed as familiarity. It's not paranoia. It's protection. We don't teach kids enough about those subtle warning signs. We teach them to trust badges, not behavior. We tell them to respect adults, but we don't always tell them when to say no. I got lucky. I said no at just the right moment. But I shouldn't have had to rely on luck. I should have had more tools. We all should. To this day, I still remember the way he said donut like it was a code word. The way he smiled when I hesitated. The way he pointed at that truck like he was offering a prize. But I also remember how I turned away, how I sat back down, how I trusted that whisper in my chest. That single decision was my shield. That hesitation was my armor. And because of that, I'm here to tell this story, not as a victim, but as a warning. Not as someone who was hurt, but as someone who saw the storm approaching and chose, just in time, to walk the other way. Story 6. The Man at the Door. I had just moved to a new city for work, chasing stability and the faint idea of a fresh start. Housing prices were steep, and the nicer parts of town were well out of my budget, so I settled on a newly renovated apartment just on the edge of a rougher neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean, affordable, and mine. At first, everything seemed fine. The neighbors mostly kept to themselves. The street was quiet after dark. It wasn't long, though, before I began noticing the couple who lived directly above me. They were loud, always arguing, screaming matches that seemed to erupt without warning and die down just as suddenly. Doors slammed. Objects were thrown. It became routine. I'd lie awake listening to the chaos above, wondering if it would end with someone getting hurt. I found out the man was a drug dealer, and while I didn't know the details, it explained the steady stream of strangers coming and going at all hours. One night I had just finished a long shift. It was past 10:30 when I finally got into bed, physically exhausted and mentally spent. I hadn't even turned off the lamp when I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't a light knock. It was firm, insistent. I sat up, confused. No one had called or texted. I wasn't expecting anyone. And more importantly, to get to my apartment door, someone would need to get through the building's locked front entrance, which required either a key or being buzzed in. That alone should have made me pause. But something about the knock, it was just persistent enough to get me out of bed. I made my way to the front door and cracked it open, keeping the chain lock in place. Standing just outside was a man, probably late 20s or early 30s, wearing a black hoodie and jeans. He was rocking back and forth slightly, like he couldn't stay still. As soon as he saw me, he leaned forward, pressing himself against the gap in the door, trying to wedge it open with his shoulder. "I need to talk to Brad," he said, over and over again. "Let me in. I need to talk to Brad." His voice was jittery, too fast, too loud. My heart kicked into overdrive. I told him that no one named Brad lived there, that he must have the wrong apartment, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were wide and darting. He kept pushing, trying to force the door open. I gripped the edge of the door with all my strength, using my body weight to keep it closed against the chain. He repeated it again and again like a chant. Let me in. I need to talk to Brad. I kept saying no, my voice louder each time. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably 2 or 3 minutes, he tried to get in, pushing against the door, pleading, demanding. Then, just as suddenly, he stopped. He stood up straight, backed away without another word, and walked off into the night. I locked the door fully, stepped back, and just stood there in the living room, hands shaking. My brain was still trying to process what had just happened. I hadn't let him in. That was good. But why had I even opened the door in the first place? That thought haunted me. I tried to distract myself by cleaning up the kitchen, but I couldn't stop thinking about how close he had been, how determined. A few minutes later, I heard a loud crash echo through the building. I cautiously stepped into the hallway and peered down the stairwell toward the lobby. The glass front door of the building had been shattered completely. That's how he got in, not by being buzzed in. He had smashed the door open with something heavy, maybe a brick, maybe his own body. The jagged edges of glass still glinted under the dim security light. It hit me then. He hadn't just wandered in. He had broken in. And when he didn't find the person he was looking for, he tried to force his way into the first apartment he could find. Mine. I learned later that he was one of the drug dealer's regulars, likely high or desperate or both. I never learned his name. I didn't need to. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the hallway, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I locked every door. I blocked the front entrance with a chair. I even slept with a kitchen knife tucked under my pillow, something I never imagined I would do. I kept telling myself I was safe now, but I didn't believe it. Safety is an illusion that disappears the moment it's broken. And that night, mine shattered right along with that glass door. The next day, I spoke with the building manager. He was apologetic but not surprised. That guy's been around, he said. We've had problems before. They patched the door and promised better security, but the truth was, nothing had changed. There was no camera, no guard, no way to stop someone from doing it again. The upstairs neighbor didn't say a word. He knew what had happened. The broken glass, the midnight screaming. But he stayed silent. It was like we all lived in our own bubbles, pretending not to see, pretending not to hear. I started looking for new places to live that same week. I didn't feel safe anymore, and no rent price was worth that feeling. But even after I moved, I carried the memory with me. I carried the image of that man's face, vacant, jittery, aggressive. I remembered the force of his body against the door, the way his voice got louder and louder, the sudden stillness when he gave up. I played it over in my mind, like a film I couldn't stop rewinding, not because I wanted to relive it, but because part of me kept asking, what if I hadn't locked the chain? What if I had opened the door a little wider? What if I had tried to reason with him longer? That's the terrifying part. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens. No one got hurt. But it was close, too close to something that could have ended very differently. Now I trust my instincts more. I don't open the door unless I'm absolutely sure. I don't question that tight feeling in my chest when something doesn't seem right. People often think fear is loud, but more often it's quiet. It's the knot in your stomach, the way your hand hovers near the lock, the way your voice changes just slightly when you tell someone no. That night, fear whispered, and I listened just in time. I didn't become a victim, but I came close enough to see the edge. That's why I share this story, not to scare, but to remind. Your home should be your safest place, but safety isn't always guaranteed. Sometimes it's something you have to fight for, door by door, night by night. Story 7. The Red Car. I work overnight shifts at a hotel in a part of town that never quite settles, even in the dead hours. The streets feel different after midnight, slower, quieter, yet somehow heavier. I'm a woman, and I've learned to project a kind of armor behind the front desk. My demeanor is unapproachable, sharp, but not unfriendly. I wear the tired smile of someone who's seen enough to trust her instincts and I speak in clipped tones to people who linger too long in the lobby. That night started like any other. I was sipping lukewarm coffee and sorting receipts when I noticed a couple outside the hotel, smoking near the curb. The man was loud, drunk by the looks of it, but not threatening, just stumbling and talking too much. His arms slung loosely around the waist of a woman who looked tired but content. She was pretty, maybe early 30s, and clearly trying to humor him as he kissed her cheek between slurred compliments. It was the kind of interaction I'd seen 100 times before. Intoxicated affection, sloppy, awkward, but harmless. What struck me as odd wasn't them, but the man walking toward them from the shadows. He was wearing an army uniform, complete with hat and badges. He had a slow, purposeful stride, like someone who already knew exactly what he was going to do. He stopped beside the couple and said something I couldn't hear through the glass. The drunk man startled a bit, confused, and started patting his pockets. Maybe the uniformed man had asked for a cigarette or a light. The woman was halfway through a laugh when it happened. A red four-door car came out of nowhere, screeching around the corner like it had been shot from a cannon. It slammed to a stop right in front of the couple, tires skidding, and before I could process what I was seeing, the woman was yanked into the back seat by someone inside the car. The man was next. One of the people in the car threw the door open, grabbed him by the shirt, and shoved him into the vehicle. It all happened in seconds. The man in the uniform jumped into the front seat. The doors slammed shut, and the red car peeled off into the darkness with a kind of speed that screams planning, not panic. I was frozen behind the desk. It had all unfolded right in front of me, just outside the glass. And I hadn't moved. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't even made it to the phone. I just stood there, watching helplessly as two people were snatched from the sidewalk like they were nothing. My fingers finally caught up with my brain, fumbling for the phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. But I already knew it would be too late. They were gone. The dispatcher was calm, too calm, asking me to describe the car, the people, the license plate. I didn't know. I hadn't seen, I had frozen. The only detail I could give was the red color of the car, and even that felt like an insult to the magnitude of what had just occurred. The police arrived 10 minutes later, 10 years it felt like, and asked me the same questions. I gave them everything I could, but my memory already felt slippery, like the edges of a nightmare fading upon waking. I watched them file the report, take down my name, and drive away into the same darkness that had swallowed that red car. And then I was alone again, standing behind the same desk, in the same lobby, but the world no longer felt the same. That night changed how I viewed my job. It wasn't just about checking in guests or resetting key cards anymore. It was about being a witness to something that should never have happened. I stayed at that desk for the rest of the night, unable to sleep even for a moment. I replayed it in my mind over and over. How the soldier had timed his arrival perfectly. How the car had arrived at the exact moment he made contact. How smooth the entire operation had been. It was coordinated, intentional, professional. That wasn't random. That wasn't spontaneous. That was abduction disguised as coincidence. And it happened just a few feet from where I stood. In the days that followed, I kept expecting someone to come back, police, reporters, anyone, but no one did. No follow-up, no arrests, no confirmation that they were found. The hotel replaced the camera by the door, but I never saw the footage. Maybe it was corrupted. Maybe it showed too much. I'll never know. I only know what I saw and what I didn't do. That's the part that lingers. Not guilt, exactly, but a helplessness that seeps into your bones and doesn't leave. I still don't know who they were. I never saw their faces clearly enough to remember, but I'll always remember that car, red like a warning, fast like a scream you can't catch. I started watching the street differently after that. Every parked car felt suspicious. Every stranger standing too still made my pulse quicken. I began checking the surveillance feed twice as often. I started keeping a notebook behind the desk, jotting down odd details, license plates, strange guests, times when something just felt off. I didn't want to be caught off guard again. I couldn't stop what had happened, but maybe next time I could do something. Maybe that's all you can ask for after witnessing something so surreal, to be better prepared if it ever happens again. to make peace with the fact that sometimes evil doesn't knock, it accelerates. People think of abductions as things that happen in isolated places or in dark alleyways, but this happened under a street lamp, beside a hotel in plain view. It was quick, clean, efficient. That's what terrified me most. How normal it all looked until it didn't. That couple, whoever they were, probably thought they were safe, laughing, teasing, just finishing a cigarette. They didn't know they were being watched. They didn't know the plan had already begun. And now, wherever they are, I hope they're alive. I hope they made it out. But I also know that hope is fragile, and sometimes it's all we have. I still work the night shift. I still stand behind that desk, but I do it differently now. I listen more closely. I look through the glass with sharper eyes. And sometimes, when the street outside is still and empty, I remember that red car, the way it moved, the way it disappeared. And I remind myself that danger doesn't always look like danger. Sometimes it looks like a man in a uniform, a friendly request, a quiet street. And sometimes, the only thing between the world you know and the one you fear is a pane of glass, and one moment too slow to act. Story 8. The knock at the door. It happened during my final year of college. I lived in a 2-bedroom on-campus apartment with 4 other girls. 5 of us in total, navigating school, relationships, and life in that delicate window between youth and adulthood. My actual roommate, Christine, was my best friend. We had been inseparable since freshman year and had lived together for 3 years straight. We were the kind of roommates people envy. No drama, no tension, just an unspoken understanding and an endless stream of late-night conversations and inside jokes. We often joked that we had used up all our roommate luck because the other 2 girls we shared our apartment with, Chelsea and Brittany, brought more chaos than we ever asked for. Chelsea was quiet, mostly kept to herself, but Brittany was complicated. She constantly brought home different men, even though she had a boyfriend who carried a gun, a boyfriend with anger issues. That night, campus was alive with celebration. It was St. Patrick's Day, and the university was hosting a huge event complete with free concerts and thousands of students filling every corner of campus. Christine and I had no interest in the madness. We stayed in our apartment, curled up on the couch in our pajamas, binge-watching reruns of Friends. The laughter from the television filled the air, a soft counterbalance to the noise outside. We were halfway through another episode when there was a knock on our front door. It wasn't a soft knock. It was firm, loud, urgent. "I need to borrow your phone." Christine and I froze. We looked at each other, not in panic but in shared suspicion. We both knew Brittany's boyfriends, or one-night flings, had a habit of showing up uninvited. I whispered, "What should we do?" Christine didn't respond immediately, but I saw the answer in her eyes. She wanted to ignore it, so I said it for her. "Let's pretend we're not here." We muted the television, turned off the living room light, and sat still. The knocking continued. The man repeated his request. He needed a phone. He didn't sound frantic, didn't sound hurt, just persistent. We didn't move. After a while he left. We could hear his footsteps retreating. The silence returned, and we looked at each other with relieved smiles. That was weird, we agreed, but probably nothing serious. We returned to our show and finished the episode. But when we checked our phones, we both had received the same emergency campus-wide alert. A stabbing had occurred, not just anywhere on campus, but in our very apartment building. The message chilled my blood. The incident happened just minutes before. A man had knocked on a door upstairs, asked to borrow a phone, been let in, and then stabbed a woman multiple times. No motive, no connection, just violence. A complete stranger. We sat in silence, the gravity of what we had avoided settling over us like a shadow. I looked at Christine and asked, could it have been him? She shook her head slowly. No, it couldn't be. But we both knew. We knew it could have been us. Our apartment was on the ground floor, right next to the stairs. If someone were going door to door, we would have been the first. And maybe we were. Maybe we had just outwaited death. We barricaded the door to our room that night. Neither of us slept. Every sound became a reason to hold our breath. The next day we read the news. The attacker had no known connection to the victim. He had knocked on her door, used her kindness as a weapon, and left her bleeding. She survived, but just barely, and he disappeared into the crowd. Thousands of students, music echoing through the air, laughter masking the horror of what had just happened. The police never found him. He blended into the festival and vanished. I don't remember what the school did after that. More patrols maybe, more warnings. But the fear didn't leave. It hung in the corners of our apartment, in every knock on the door, in every unknown voice outside. We told our families eventually. My mom was horrified. She had seen the alert too and had pieced it together even before I did. I think she realized before I did just how close I had come to being the one in that article. The experience never left us. Christine and I, already close, became even more deeply bonded by that shared brush with danger. Every time we brought it up, the conversation ended the same way. What if we had opened the door? It's a question that hangs like unfinished breath. We still talk sometimes, even now, years later. That night always comes up. It has become one of those quiet turning points in her life. Something you never planned for, never expected, and never forget. I think about the man who knocked, whoever he was. I wonder what he was thinking, if he picked a door at random, or if he watched from the shadows. I wonder what made him choose the girl upstairs. Was it the light in the window? Was it just bad luck? And I think about the girl who opened her door. How normal her night must have felt just moments before it was shattered. It's strange how thin the line is between normal and nightmare. A simple knock, a polite voice, a request for help. We're raised to be kind, to trust. But sometimes, trust is the opening a predator needs. That's the lesson I carry now. Not paranoia, but caution. Not fear, but awareness. I don't answer knocks without looking. I don't open the door just because someone asks for help. Some people hear stories like this and say, that would never happen to me. But I know better, because it almost did. It almost happened to me. And the only thing that saved us was silence. We didn't speak. We didn't open the door. And in that silence we lived. Story 9. After hours at the vet clinic. I worked as a vet tech for several years, mostly doing overnight shifts at a 24-hour animal clinic on the outskirts of town. The job was demanding, sometimes emotionally exhausting, but I loved it. I didn't mind the late hours, and I liked the quiet that came when most of the staff had gone home. Just me, the animals, and the hum of fluorescent lights. There was something peaceful about walking down dim hallways, checking on recovering pets in their kennels, whispering reassurances to them in the stillness of the night. On most nights the routine was calm, but this night was not like most. This night the peace broke, and something darker seeped in through the cracks of the ordinary. It started with a power outage. Around 10 p.m. the lights flickered twice, then cut out entirely. Backup generators kicked on immediately, but only half the clinic was lit, and the rest sank into shadow. I was alone in the back room, washing surgical tools, when it happened. The air changed, like something had entered the building, even though no doors had opened. I shrugged off the feeling and went about my duties. A couple of cats meowed louder than usual in the darkness, and one dog began to whine softly in his kennel. I told myself they were just spooked by the outage. I was too. I walked to the front to check the circuit breaker and spotted something strange on the reception desk, an empty dog carrier that hadn't been there earlier. I didn't hear anyone come in. No car pulled up outside. The glass front doors were still locked, and yet the carrier sat there like someone had just left it moments ago. I called out hello, but got no answer. I stepped into the lobby, feeling the cold air bite at my skin. The room was silent except for the low buzz of one flickering light overhead. I walked around to check the side hallway, thinking maybe someone had wandered in and was waiting. That's when I saw him. A man, tall and gaunt, standing near the surgical prep area. He was dressed in black. No jacket despite the cold, and he wasn't moving. Just standing still, his face hidden in shadow. My heart kicked. I hadn't heard him walk in. I hadn't seen the door open. There was no sound. Just him. I called out again. Louder. Sir, we're closed. Can I help you? Still nothing. No movement. Just that eerie stillness, as if he were a statue dropped into the middle of my night. I took a cautious step forward, clutching the clipboard I had in my hand like it could protect me. That's when he finally spoke, his voice raspy and dry like wind passing through dead leaves. She's not in there anymore, he said. I blinked, confused. Who? I asked. He tilted his head, slowly like a puppet whose strings had been pulled wrong. The dog, he said. She left. You should leave too. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to look at the kennel room behind me. All the animals were where they had been. None had escaped. Nothing had changed. When I turned back to confront the man, he was gone. I didn't hear him walk away. No footsteps. No doors. Just vanished. I ran to the lobby, checked every door, checked the parking lot. Nothing. Empty. Just the soft hum of the backup lights and the distant whine of a dog who now seemed even more restless. I locked every door, double-checked every kennel, and retreated to the break room, locking that door too. I sat there for what felt like hours, barely breathing, waiting for dawn. My hands shook as I scrolled through my phone, rereading emergency procedures, thinking maybe I should call the police, but what would I say? That a strange man appeared and vanished without a sound, that he said something cryptic, and then disappeared. I knew how it would sound, and part of me wasn't even sure what I had seen. The next morning, when the day staff arrived, I told my supervisor everything. She checked the security footage. That's when things got worse. The footage showed the power flicker and go out. Then, several minutes of static. Then me, walking into the lobby, calling out, looking around. But no man. No carrier. No figure in the hallway. I was talking to no one. I was reacting to something or someone who never showed up on camera. They asked if I was okay, if I needed time off. I said no. I just needed sleep. Maybe I was overworked. Maybe it was stress. That's what I told them. But deep down, I knew what I saw. I knew I hadn't imagined that voice, that presence. A few days later, I asked the receptionist about the dog carrier. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't even touched it. But it was gone. She said she never saw one. Said no clients had dropped anything off. It had simply disappeared. Like everything else that night. That's the part that stuck with me. The man. His words. She's not in there anymore. Who was he talking about? Was he warning me? Threatening me? I don't know. But I haven't worked an overnight shift since. I switched clinics, moved to a smaller town. One where the nights are quieter, and the animals are the only ones wandering the halls. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night, certain I've heard that same voice whispering from a corner of the room. Not loud, not angry, just there, present, lingering. I never leave my doors unlocked anymore, and I never assume I'm alone just because I can't see anyone. That night at the clinic taught me that some things slip between the cracks of what we call real. They visit when the lights flicker, when we're tired enough to doubt ourselves, but they're there, watching, waiting. And sometimes they leave behind more questions than answers, the kind of questions that never truly go away. Story 10. The Watcher in the Woods. It was supposed to be a weekend of peace. Just 4 friends escaping the noise of everyday life with a cabin in the woods. We were all in our late 20s, craving stillness, a break from our screens, and the kind of bonding you only get when you're deep in nature with no cell signal and nowhere to be. The cabin was old but solid, surrounded by thick pines that stretched toward the sky like silent sentinels. There was a fire pit out front, a narrow trail down to a cold, clear lake, and not a neighbor for miles. We unpacked with excitement, lit a fire, and laughed late into the night, our voices echoing off the trees. It was exactly what we needed. Or at least we thought so at first. That first night something felt off, but I didn't say anything. Maybe it was just the quiet so absolute it felt unnatural. You don't realize how loud the world is until you step away from it. No cars, no humming appliances, just wind and distant owl calls. Still, even in the peace, there was a tension underneath, like the forest was holding its breath. Around midnight, after everyone had gone inside, I stayed back to put out the fire. As I scattered the coals, I felt it. Eyes. The unmistakable sense of being watched. I turned toward the woods, heart suddenly loud in my chest. At first I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the edge of the fire's dying light, I saw it. A figure. Motionless. Human-shaped. Blending into the trees. I blinked. Looked again. Gone. I stood frozen for a second, then rushed inside and locked the door behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination. Just a shadow. The trick of the trees. I didn't tell the others. He didn't want to be that person, the paranoid one. But the next night, it happened again. This time we were all outside, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Laughter hung in the air when one of us, Eli, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Did you see that?" he whispered. We turned, scanning the woods. Nothing. But he swore he saw movement, a flash of white deep among the pines. We brushed it off, made a joke, and went back to our stories. But the laughter was thinner now, a little forced. The forest had shifted, and we all felt it. That night we heard footsteps around the cabin. Not animals' slow, deliberate steps circling. Someone even knocked on the back door. Just once. A single knock. By the time we turned on all the lights and rushed to look, no one was there. We locked every window, closed every curtain, sat in the living room with flashlights and growing unease. Nobody slept well. In the morning we found boot prints in the mud, big ones, just outside the back door, and scratches along the wooden paneling that hadn't been there before. Deep, deliberate, like someone dragging a blade or tool. That's when we knew it wasn't in our heads. Someone was out there, watching us, testing the boundaries. We debated leaving. But daylight has a way of making you feel safe again. We told ourselves it was probably just a hiker, a prank, something explainable. So we stayed. We shouldn't have. That final night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., we were jolted awake by the sound of the generator dying. Total darkness swallowed the cabin. No lights. No heat. Just black silence. Then came the knocking, soft, slow, all around the cabin. Not just the doors. The walls. The windows. A sound that made your skin tighten. We huddled in the living room. Flashlights flickering, too scared to move. Ely gripped a fire poker. Sarah had her phone out, though it had no service. I remember my hands trembling uncontrollably, not from cold, but from knowing, deep down, that we were no longer alone. After nearly an hour of torment, it all stopped. Just silence. No footsteps. No knocking. Just the creaking of the cabin and our shallow breaths. We stayed awake until dawn. When the first light of morning touched the windows, we grabbed our things and left without speaking. We didn't even clean up. We just packed and drove, hearts still thudding. I didn't look back, but I could feel it. That presence still lingering among the trees, watching us go. When we reached town, we reported it to the sheriff. He listened, nodded, and told us it wasn't the first time. That others had come down from that forest with similar stories. Some even found carvings in trees, names of people who'd never returned. He said they never found who was responsible, that the woods had secrets, and it was best to stay away. I don't know what that figure wanted. Maybe it was just playing with us. Maybe it was waiting for us to make a mistake. But I know what I felt. That cold certainty of being prey, of being studied. And I've never returned to that forest. None of us have. We still talk sometimes, and when we do, we always circle back to that weekend, to the figure, the knocking, the feeling of eyes in the dark. Some things you carry with you, no matter how far you run, and when the night is especially quiet, I sometimes hear it again, that slow, deliberate knock, echoing in the space just beyond the walls, and I wonder, what would have happened if we had opened the door?